The food on our plates is getting more and more expensive. An acute energy crisis has engulfed the world. And now, at a time like this, you would expect the leaders of the world to work towards faster solutions. But you couldn't be more wrong. Why do I say that? Well, you need to only see what has happened at the G20 foreign ministers meeting. And of course, we're looking at the summit as it unfolds in Delhi. What has happened? Number one, there was no joint statement because the countries could not agree on some issues. Number two, the US Foreign Secretary has been targeting Russia, saying this meeting has been marred by the war in Ukraine. And number three, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergey Lavrov, has apparently apologized for the alleged indecent behavior of the Western delegations. What has India done? Prime Minister Modi has captured all these divisions in that speech that he made earlier. Here's what he said.
The experience of the last few years, financial crisis, climate change, pandemic, terrorism, and wars, clearly shows that global governance has failed in both its mandates. No group can claim global leadership without listening to those most affected by its decisions.
For much of the global south, this is a make or break issue. That the costs of fuel, the cost of food, the cost of fertilizer, the availability of fertilizer, which means next year's food, these are all extremely pressing issues. And if you see some of the countries who were already struggling with debt, who were already impacted by the pandemic, for them, this conflict, the knock-on effects of this conflict coming on top of that, has been really, damaging is a very, very mild word. It's not realistic, it's not credible to talk about the future of the global economy and the multilateral order if we are not able to really address and focus on the issues of those who are most in need.
There's been a lot of talk over all of today, but there's going to be no joint statement after the G20 foreign ministers meeting. And the primary reason for that is that Russia and the West could not agree on Ukraine, which is why Sergey Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, later said that there was no way that Russia and the West could agree or Russia could accept the terms that the West had set as far as Ukraine was concerned. He said the G20 has been in practice from 1999. There have been so many things since then. Yugoslavia, Iraq, all kinds of problems. They never came up before the G20. Why should this one? Apart from all that, of course, the important thing is that Lavrov has said that he would not mind if India headed an effort to bring peace to the Ukraine. We'll have to see what Ukraine has to say on it and also the West.
My colleague Srinjoy reporting there. Meanwhile, let's put this in perspective. We've got our guest joining us. Maroof Raza is our consultant and strategic affairs expert, and he joins us with former Ambassador Suresh Goel. Great to have you both, gentlemen. Maroof, to you first. This G20 stage is clearly being used by the US to say that the war is unprovoked, it's unjustified. Russia is using it to accuse the West of blackmail and threats. They're trading blows at this summit. How much of this is strategy, you think, and how much is it really sheer indignation that we are seeing on display at this summit?
Well, the war was certainly not unprovoked, because if you take the sum of activities that have been evolving on the Russia-Ukraine front for the last so many years, before the Russians decided to invade Ukraine. And I am not saying that. Many American political scientists are of the view that the Russians were pushed into retaliating in the way they did, and essentially comes from 2007 onwards, when America and its friends in NATO decided that they are going to creep closer and closer to the Russian border till Russia backs off. I mean, it's not going to back off from its own territory. So Ukraine and Russia were sharing a boundary, and they expected Russia to allow a NATO buildup, which was something that Putin had kept warning. The second thing was that the entire Western community were really assuming that the post-Cold War dividend of peace would continue to prevail regardless of whatever else America or the NATO did. And they were proved to be wrong. And the third thing was that the Western countries were hell-bent on reducing the world into a bipolar situation, assuming that China would be the only rival they would have to deal with, and Russia should be pushed back into the rabbit hole that they felt that that's where Russia's place was. So all that put together, please go back to the Kosovo crisis. Please go back to the time when Russia was a much weaker country after the end of the Cold War, when Putin and Lavrov, his foreign minister now, was Russia's representative at the UN. They kept asking for a greater UN mandate and clarity before the West resorted to the kind of bombings they did in Kosovo. The West, and particularly America, didn't pay heed. And now to turn around and say, yes, certainly Russia has gone over the top. It has destroyed the lives of hundreds and thousands of people. It has certainly destroyed Ukraine. And as Mr. Jaishankar brought out in his speech, it has had a huge impact on food, fertilizer, fuel prices, and a whole lot of other things. Right. But any dispassionate study of the reasons that led to the conflict will tell you that initially Russia wasn't at fault. Now, certainly, I would like to say that Russia has really overplayed its hand, and the mismanagement of the conflict,
well, we are seeing both sides, as it were, Maroof. I mean, we are seeing both sides push their cause, but at this time, we're seeing India, which is at an important position at the presidential level of the G20, really suffer because of what is clearly a war, and there is a standoff between two sides. Suresh Goel, India has been positioning itself as a leading voice of developing countries, the voice of the global south. And this has been happening over recent years. Do you see India doing enough to salvage the situation in what you heard Prime Minister Modi say, turning it back to the original focus in trying to do that, which was on issues affecting developing countries like food security, like energy security, and the impact of global warming caused by actions of the West on developing countries like India? So my question is, what could India be doing more of, to have less of this war rhetoric flying around the summit and more of these real issues?
I think your question, last question, what could India be doing more to handle this kind of rhetoric, is much closer to the real question that we need to ask than what we are doing. Let us look at the situation really on ground. I think what happened in 1991 was that the Cold War ended on ground, but the Cold War attitude did not vanish. The agenda of the West to get as close militarily through NATO, as close to Russian borders as possible, continued despite assurances to the contrary. And there were, even at that time, there was a huge debate taking place. NATO's eastward expansion, guarantees given by NATO and the USA not to go beyond a point. And then you had the Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Croatian, the wars in Europe. It continued. Fact is that eventual agenda for the West is to get the last bastion of socialism from Europe out as far as possible. And that is not happening so easily. Finally, Putin has dug his heels. Now, what is in India's interest, and what is India's capacity? Can India actually do anything between the USA, I'm not even counting Ukraine. Ukraine is actually acting as a proxy for the USA. Can India do anything between the USA and the Russian Federation because of its own linkages with the two countries economically, and our own interest, friendship, etc., etc.? I think in this particular scenario, both Russian Federation and the USA, their ultimate objective has not changed. And in that process, whether India pleads, does whatever it wants, economic, ultimately they are going to remain where they are. So therefore,
It's
India's
going to go
capacity
in
in that sense
India's
is limited.
favor. What you're saying, Mr. Goel, is that as
No,
far as the agenda for India is concerned, in its capacity to lead the G20, that is something that is going to get overshadowed. Is that by design, you think, Maroof? Because, yes, the West really has to take what India and the rest of the developing world has to say, because it's been playing that role, that you are responsible for some of the agonies that developing countries are facing right now, and perhaps the West doesn't want to get into that discussion. Would you agree with that, Maroof?
Yeah, in a way, because, we have to set realistic goals of what we can achieve in our capacity as G20 presidency. Please understand that G20 is a forum which has been expanded from its original G7. The rotatory presidency will go away from us in a year's time. Becoming president in a rotatory term in G20 doesn't make you the most powerful nation in the world. You're just a coordinator for this year's activities. India wants to achieve various things on a high note, but also we must understand that our credibility in the eyes of the West, they're not saying so on our face because we provide them a big market and we're still a democracy and they love the idea of engaging only with democracies, that they're not saying so on our face, that our credibility is dented in their eyes because we've taken a nuanced and a well thought through stand that we are not on any one camp and we are taking measured steps towards the end solution. The second thing is that India has achieved something in this G20 engagement, where India's foreign minister has had the chance in the given scenario, in a time frame of 48 hours, to engage with all the important foreign ministers of the world. And this will give our foreign office a more holistic perspective. And it wasn't like Mr. Jaishankar was flying to Washington, then flying to Moscow, then flying to Beijing, and then coming back and making some analysis. But here, they were very quickly piecing together the mood as it prevailed at one given time in one city, that is in Delhi. The third thing is that, everyone, the big players really, as Mr. Goel has rightly brought out, Ukraine is the battleground. Ukraine is the scapegoat, the fall guy. And Ukraine has made it very clear that its patrons are in Washington and NATO. And Ukraine apart, America has made a lot of money out of this conflict. Russia is making money selling oil at phenomenal prices. America is fulfilling now Europe's requirement of oil and gas after Europe filled its tankers and also did not implement the sanctions till early December, and now is buying it from America and some of its friends in the Gulf. Also, arms sales are happening like never before, at least in the last decade or more, and therefore American companies are making a lot of money out of arms sales. European countries have hiked up their defense expenditure to 2% of GDP, which is a lot of money for many countries. Germany is looking at spending $120 billion over the next 10 years, billion euros. So, there's a lot of money floating around.
Yes.
Russia is also making money selling oil and building a greater rapport with China when China is happy to lap up whatever it can get from Russia.
Yes.
And India has also increased its oil buys from Russia from 2% to 24%. So all that put together, and then, of course, as you brought out, the global oil pricing is gone for a six, because pricing of the oil was agreed by OPEC to put it at $60 a barrel. But, the war fear and the risk syndrome makes the speculators make it go up to $100, $120 a barrel.
Correct.
So the oil producing countries make a lot of money. And finally, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, and Ukraine was also providing a lot of grain to Africa and fertilizers. So all that has gone through the roof.
Correct.
So clearly the recipients have been the G20, as you are bringing out,
Yes.
the global south.
Exactly.
The global south.
Yes.
The rich countries will take care of themselves. It is the moderate and poor countries
Yes.
that are going to pay a very heavy price.
So
and
are
that
we
is
paying
where,
a price?
That
No,
is where,
yes.
that is where the foreign ministers should strike a consensus how to improve the plight of the poor and not so well-off countries. Forget about the rich
But I don't know
countries.
how much
They'll
of
take
that
care
is
of
on the
themselves.
agenda. Mr. Goel, none of this important stuff as far as the countries that we are talking about, developing countries and poor countries, none of their causes are on the agenda right now. As a global committee of nations, Mr. Goel, the G20 has the world's 19 wealthiest nations plus the European Union, and together they make up 85% of the global economic output. And we're talking about 2/3 of the world's population over here getting represented. I'm just asking you, playing the devil's advocate, is India being prudent by not taking sides in the war? And here we're not just talking about the involvement of Russia and the US, but China is clearly in the fray as well. So is this working against us, our non-aligned approach, when it comes to what we can take away from the presidential role of the G20? Mr. Goel.
I think we continue to talk in the old parlance, the old world language. It's not an issue of taking sides. It's an issue of strategizing the interest of the developing countries. When the developed countries come to us in the G20, please remember the origin of G20 was to resolve the financial crisis of 1997, I forget the year. But there was a financial crisis when the foreign ministers forum was established. And later on, in 2000, it became, after the Lehman Brothers crisis, it became the summit meeting. They come to us basically because any failure in the global financial systems creates a void in the market. Their own industry begins to suffer. They depend upon the developing countries for the markets, for the sales, for the supply chains. The problem is that we think we depend upon them for what we need, without realizing that they depend on us for what they need. If we are able to establish that as a relationship of equal, that you have what we need and we will give you what you need, but it must be equals relationship, I think that might work better. But the problem is, it is not happening at all at the moment. There is a relationship of complete dependence on one or the other, without realizing that breaking this link is going to harm both the sides. If today the global markets are not available to Europe, where will they be?
Absolutely. There's no taking away from this. It's an opportunity, a great opportunity for the G20 to do constructive work. But the war has continued and there are no sign of peace talks. The world remains as divided, if not more so. And many big economies are still in turmoil because of this. Perhaps much more if this war continues. There are differences among this Committee of Nations, which is evident in the fact that there is no joint statement. The situation pretty grim when it comes to constructive discussions that should actually help bridge the differences between countries, not drive deeper wedges. In any case, we are always very hopeful that the war will end, and so will the misery that it brings to economies around the world. Maroof, Mr. Goel, always a pleasure having you with us on India Tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Meanwhile, we are watching all the developments as far as the global economies are concerned, and of course,